There's this there's a highly specific cognitive shift that happens the exact moment you cross the threshold of a clinic and step out into the parking lot.
Oh, yeah. The parking lot moment. It's jarring.
It really is because, inside the exam room, you're enveloped in this completely structured professional environment.
Right, you're safe.
Exactly, you're safe. The clinician sits across from you. They outline a diagnosis, which is often something chronic, something that fundamentally alters the trajectory of your daily routine.
Yeah.
And they hand you a prescription, they explain the rationale, and in that controlled space, the entire treatment plan sounds like entirely cohesive. The logic just holds up.
It makes perfect sense while you're in the chair.
Right. But then the second those automatic sliding doors close behind you, the whole architecture of support just vanishes.
Completely evaporates.
You're just standing there by your car holding this flimsy piece of paper, and the realization hits you. You're no longer a patient receiving care, right? You are suddenly the sole project manager of a highly complex physiological process that you barely even understand.
And that transition, that is honestly one of the most precarious moments in modern healthcare.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Because in the clinic, the responsibility for synthesizing all that information rests entirely with the physician.
Right.
But out in the parking lot, that burden is transferred 100% to the individual.
It's all on you.
It's all on you.
Yeah.
You're suddenly expected to integrate new pharmacological compounds into your biology.
Yeah.
You have to monitor for side effects, adjust your lifestyle, and somehow maintain this perfect understanding of the clinical intent.
Which is impossible for most people.
It is. The structural failure happens because we expect patients to manage this immense logistical and medical burden without giving them, the foundational infrastructure to actually understand what they're doing.
And that lack of infrastructure is precisely what we are targeting in today's deep dive.
It's the core issue.
It is. We're looking at the absolute necessity of independent medical information. And we're specifically looking through the lens of a framework outlined in our source material today, which is called the iMedix protocol, Navigating the Path to Diabetes Reversal.
Right, a fascinating document.
It really is. The sources we're working with detail the iMedix platform, which is an independent medical information resource designed to address medication safety, answer really complex treatment questions, and provide foundational patient education.
Yeah, building that map.
Building the map, exactly. We're exploring how having a reliable, objective map completely alters the patient experience. Because the core question posed by the material, like, can you actually reverse type 2 diabetes? That is a monumental question.
Massive.
But we can't even approach the mechanics of that question until we understand how patients are receiving their medical data in the first place,
Absolutely. The whole premise of tackling a concept as significant as diabetes reversal is inherently reliant on your information architecture.
Information architecture, I like that.
Yeah, we're naturally drawn to the gravity of the outcome, right? The idea of reversing a chronic metabolic condition is incredibly appealing.
Obviously, yeah. Who wouldn't want that?
Exactly. But an outcome is just the final data point on a very, very long graph. You can't safely pursue an outcome of that magnitude without first establishing a rigorous understanding of medication risks, contraindications, patient safety.
The tools have to precede the task.
Exactly. The tools must precede the task. And the iMedix documentation focuses heavily on this concept. Before you can navigate a complex treatment path, you have to ensure the map you're using isn't fundamentally flawed.
Which forces us to look at the maps people are currently using, right?
And they are not great.
They really are. Because if I'm standing in that parking lot holding a new prescription, my immediate instinct isn't to drive to a university medical library.
No, of course not.
My instinct is to pull out my phone and just search for the drug name.
Yes.
I want to know the side effects. I want to know the success rate. And the source material emphasizes that iMedix operates as an independent medical information platform.
Yes, that word is key. Independent.
So structurally, what does independence actually mean here? Because if I can just go on my phone and access 10 million search results in half a second, why is the concept of a specifically independent platform so critical to my safety?
Well, to understand why independence is critical, we have to really evaluate the incentives of the digital landscape where most people are currently getting their medical info.
Okay.
The standard commercial internet is not designed to prioritize clinical accuracy or patient safety.
Right. It's designed to make money.
Exactly. It's designed to optimize engagement and generate revenue. So when you search for a complex medical condition or a specific pharmaceutical compound, the results you get are curated by algorithms.
Algorithms that don't care about your health.
They prioritize search engine optimization, they prioritize advertising spend by pharmaceutical companies, and this is a big one, the engagement metrics of highly sensationalized anecdotal forums.
Oh, like those message boards where everyone shares their worst nightmare scenarios?
Exactly. So independence, in the context of a platform like iMedix, means a structural decoupling from all those commercial incentives.
So it's essentially functioning as a firewall.
A firewall is a great way to put it.
It separates the clinical reality of the medication from the marketing machinery of the manufacturer and, like you said, the algorithmic chaos of the search engine.
Precise.
Because if I'm trying to figure out if a medication is safe for me, and the primary source of my info is legally sanctioned marketing material that's specifically designed to minimize the perception of risk while maximizing the benefit.
Then your decision-making process is compromised before you even start.
Exactly. It's completely compromised.
Compromised and frequently just completely contradictory. Because think about it. A patient operating without an independent platform is forced to synthesize completely disparate data streams.
Right.
They read a terrifying, totally unverified horror story about a side effect on a social media thread.
Yep.
Then they go read a highly sanitized promotional website from the drug manufacturer.
Where everyone is smiling and running through a field.
Exactly. And then finally, they might stumble onto a peer-reviewed clinical abstract that uses terminology they haven't been trained to decode at all.
Which just makes them feel helpless.
Right. None of these sources are calibrated for the patient's actual health literacy. And none of them share a unified clinical ledger.
A unified ledger.
Yeah, an independent platform exists to serve as that unified ledger. Its allegiance is strictly to the objective clinical data and the safety of the end user, period.
I sort of look at this like navigating the financial markets, you know?
Okay, how so?
Well, if you're managing your retirement portfolio, you don't make massive asset allocations based on a random comment thread on a message board.
I mean, I hope not.
Right. And you certainly don't base it entirely on the glossy brochure printed by the company selling the stock.
Right. They have a vested interest.
Exactly. You require an independent cleaning house. You need a platform that simply provides the raw data, the risk metrics, the historical performance, without caring whether you buy or sell.
That's a perfect analogy.
But let me push back on the necessity of this just a little bit, given the current era we live in.
Sure.
We have AI assistants now. We have aggregated smart searches. If the sheer volume of medical data is just infinitely accessible to everyone, doesn't the cream eventually rise to the top? Like, why is a dedicated, specifically independent environment still a mandatory requirement?
Because in complex systems, especially systems like human physiology volume, does not equate to clarity.
Oh, that's interesting.
In fact, excessive volume without structural organization actually creates a signal-to-noise deficit.
You just get overwhelmed.
Exactly. A search engine might instantly aggregate a list of 20 potential side effects for a given medication. But a mere list is stripped of all the necessary clinical context.
It's just bullet points.
Right. It doesn't explain the statistical frequency of the side effect. Is it 1 in 10 or 1 in a million? It doesn't explain the biological mechanism, like why the drug actually causes that reaction.
Oh, right.
And crucially, it doesn't cross-reference that new medication with the patient's existing pharmacological profile.
Which is huge.
It's massive. The necessity of the independent platform lies in its capacity to provide structured, contextualized education rather than just an endless stream of isolated data points.
Context. That context is what transforms raw data into an actual functional tool.
Precisely.
And the source material specifically outlines the tools used to achieve this, pointing to the iMedix drug database and educational resources. It notes these are utilized to provide critical info on medications, treatment topics, patient safety. But, when we use the word database, I think the common visualization for most people is just a static spreadsheet.
Right, just rows and columns.
Exactly, rows and columns of drug names and dosages.
Yeah.
But in the context of patient safety and complex medical navigation, a database has to be far more dynamic than just a digital filing cabinet, doesn't it?
Oh, it has to be vastly more dynamic. A medical database, when it's engineered correctly, is an interactive web of pharmacological relationships.
An interactive web.
Yeah, it is not static.
Yeah.
If we look at the requirements for ensuring medication safety, the database must map out pharmacokinetics.
Okay, break that down for me.
Pharmacokinetics is essentially how a compound is absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and eventually excreted by the body.
The journey of the pill.
Exactly. So it has to catalog the specific hepatic enzymes, the enzymes in your liver
Mm.
that are responsible for breaking down the drug. Now, if a patient introduces a secondary medication that happens to inhibit that specific liver enzyme, the database has to recognize that collision.
Wait, so the second drug stops the first drug from being broken down?
Exactly. The metabolic pathway is blocked, so
Yeah.
the first drug will just accumulate in the bloodstream, potentially reaching highly toxic levels.
Wow.
A static spreadsheet cannot calculate that cascade. A dynamic relational database does.
That is a phenomenal layer of complexity, and it really highlights the reality of polypharmacy.
Yes, polypharmacy is a massive issue.
Because we aren't just talking about a healthy 30-year-old taking a single round of antibiotics for a week.
No, not at all.
We are talking about an aging population or people managing complex chronic conditions like diabetes who might be balancing 5, 6, 7 different medications simultaneously.
Very common.
They might be taking a beta blocker, a statin, an anticoagulant, an oral hypoglycemic agent, and the mathematical permutations of how all those compounds interact, how they compete for absorption in the gut or how they affect the kidneys.
It's staggering.
It really is. Expecting a human brain, even a doctor's brain, to mentally track all those interactions without a dedicated technological infrastructure is just a recipe for an adverse event.
It is the primary driver of preventable adverse drug events.
Really?
Absolutely. And this is where the integration of the drug database with patient educational resources becomes so vital. The database performs the complex computational heavy lifting, right?
What?
The algorithmic cross-referencing of enzyme pathways and contraindications.
The math.
The math. The educational resources then act as the translation layer.
I love that phrase, the translation layer.
Yeah, they take that highly complex pharmacokinetic data and they translate it into actionable health literacy for the patient.
Which raises an essential question about the objective of these resources. Because if the underlying data is that dense, where do we draw the line between educating a patient and just completely overwhelming them?
Right, you don't want to paralyze them.
Exactly. The goal can't possibly be to train the average individual to the level of a clinical pharmacologist. If I'm accessing an independent platform to understand my new prescription, I don't necessarily need to know the molecular weight of the compound.
No, you don't.
I need to know how it's going to impact my Tuesday afternoon, So how do these platforms structure the education so that it's protective rather than paralyzing?
The objective is strictly to build a functional vocabulary. It's not to issue a medical degree.
Okay, functional vocabulary.
Health literacy is about providing the patient with enough structural understanding of their treatment to recognize deviations from the expected outcome.
To know when something is wrong.
Right. If an educational resource simply hands the patient a dense 40-page clinical monograph, it has completely failed in its primary mission.
Because no one is going to read that.
Exactly. The translation layer must focus on causality.
Causality. Give me an example of that.
Okay, instead of just listing dizziness as a bullet point side effect, the resource explains the mechanism. It says this medication lowers blood pressure by dilating your blood vessels, which means if you stand up too quickly, it might cause a temporary drop in blood flow to your brain.
Oh, that distinction changes everything.
It does, doesn't it?
It completely changes the patient from just a passive recipient of a random side effect into an active observer of a biological mechanism.
Exactly.
If they just read the word dizziness, they might endure it silently, assuming it's just the cost of doing business.
Or they might just stop taking the drug out of fear.
Right. But if they understand the vascular mechanism, they have the vocabulary to return to their physician and say, hey, I am experiencing significant orthostatic hypotension when I stand up, which aligns with the vasodilator mechanism of this new drug.
Yes.
Given my existing baseline blood pressure, do we need to adjust the dosage?
That is a completely different conversation in the exam room.
It completely balances the power dynamic.
It creates a collaborative care model. But, achieving that collaborative state requires overcoming a really massive systemic hurdle.
Which is?
The source material explicitly addresses this. It highlights the widespread issue of why people often misunderstand medication risks. And it positions platforms like iMedix as the necessary countermeasure.
Right.
This misunderstanding of risk is not a marginal issue. It is a profound vulnerability in global healthcare. And it stems directly from how risk is traditionally communicated to the public.
Let's really analyze that vulnerability, because it's easy to look at a patient who ignores a warning label and just dismiss it as individual negligence. Oh, they just didn't read the bottle.
Which is a huge cop-out.
Right. But if the misunderstanding of medication risks is systemic enough that entire independent platforms are being built to combat it, we're dealing with a structural failure.
Absolutely.
So what is the root cause of this disconnect? Why do we fundamentally fail to comprehend the risks of the chemicals we are literally ingesting daily to alter our biology?
The failure is rooted in the abstraction of risk.
Abstraction.
Yes. When medication risks are presented through standard commercial or legally mandated channels, they're typically delivered as a standardized, exhaustive litany of potential adverse events.
Right, like the fast-talking guy at the end of a drug commercial.
Exactly. May cause fatigue, nausea, headache, internal bleeding, or rare cardiac events.
Yeah.
Because the list ranges from the completely mundane to the absolutely catastrophic, without any contextual weighting, the human brain simply filters it out as background noise.
It just sounds like legal protection.
It sounds like a legal indemnity clause rather than a physiological reality. We
Yeah.
fail to understand the risk because we were never actually taught the specific physiological constraints of the treatment.
It's the exact same psychological mechanism we use when we're confronting an end-user license agreement for a new piece of software.
The EULA, yes.
Right. You're presented with 50 pages of dense legal jargon before you can use the app. Intellectually, that there are significant risks buried in that text, like you might be signing away the rights to your personal data or agreeing to binding arbitration.
You don't read it.
Never. Because the language is inaccessible and the presentation is designed to be overwhelming. You just scroll to the bottom and click accept.
Exactly.
We're treating complex biochemical interventions with the same reflexive dismissal as an iPhone software update.
That is a highly accurate parallel.
Yeah.
And the consequences of clicking accept on a medication without understanding the biological terms of service are severe.
I imagine they fall into a few different buckets.
They do. When patients operate in this state of abstract risk comprehension, they generally fall into two distinct, dangerous behavioral patterns.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is noncompliance driven by unwarranted fear. They read a terrifying, mathematically improbable side effect. They lack the statistical literacy to understand absolute versus relative risk, and they simply refuse to take a life-saving medication.
I'm not taking this, it causes internal bleeding. Even if the chance is 1 in 10 million.
Exactly. The second pattern is the opposite. It's the complete dismissal of genuine danger.
They ignore the warning signs.
Right. They ignore severe early warning symptoms of toxicity because they just assume all medications make you feel somewhat unwell.
The pill just makes me nauseous, it's fine.
Right, when in reality, their liver is struggling.
Wow. And there is a third consequence to this misunderstanding, which I think perfectly sets the stage for the core medical framework we're examining today.
Absolutely.
When patients are alienated by the complexity of legitimate medical science, when the real treatments feel like an impenetrable legal contract, they become highly, highly susceptible to the illusion of simplicity.
A quick fix.
Yes. The misunderstanding of rigorous clinical paths opens the door wide for pseudoscience, miracle cures, and single-product solutions. If the real map is too hard to read, someone offering a straight line with no obstacles looks incredibly appealing.
Precisely. The desire for a frictionless solution is just human nature.
Sure.
If a patient is facing a complex, chronic condition that requires meticulous dietary adjustments, pharmacological management, and lifelong monitoring, that reality is daunting.
It's a second job.
It is. So if they do not possess the health literacy provided by an independent educational platform to understand why that complexity is necessary, they will naturally gravitate toward a marketer offering a proprietary supplement that promises to eradicate the disease overnight.
The magic tea.
The magic tea. The misunderstanding of authentic medical mechanisms literally creates the economic demand for fraudulent shortcuts.
Which brings us to the ultimate application of this foundational infrastructure. The source material doesn't just discuss independent platforms in the abstract, right? It applies these tools to one of the most significant chronic conditions globally.
Yes, type 2 diabetes.
It outlines the iMedix protocol, navigating the path to diabetes reversal. And it poses the central, highly provocative question: can you reverse type 2 diabetes?
It is a question that completely dominates modern metabolic medicine right now.
I bet.
And applying our previous discussion to this specific question, we have to immediately analyze the phrasing used in the framework.
Okay, let's look at the phrasing.
The source does not title this the iMedix cure.
Right.
It deliberately uses the phrase navigating the path to diabetes reversal and refers to it as a protocol.
A protocol.
In the clinical lexicon, a protocol is not a single intervention. It is a systematic, multidisciplinary methodology. And navigation implies an ongoing process of orientation, encountering obstacles, and adjusting your course based on continuous data feedback.
The terminology is a structural defense against the exact pseudoscience we were just discussing.
Exactly.
You don't navigate a magic wand. You navigate a complex, shifting landscape. The use of the word protocol signals to the patient that reversing or addressing type 2 diabetes is going to require every single informational tool we have covered.
Every single one.
An understanding of pharmacokinetics, an awareness of intersecting risks, and a rigorous educational baseline. But, okay, if we look strictly at the clinical reality of the question, can it be reversed? We have to define our terms really carefully here.
We do.
Because words like reversal, cure, and control are often used totally interchangeably by the public, but they mean entirely different things to a clinician, don't they?
They do. And treating those terms as interchangeable is a prime example of the health illiteracy that platforms like iMedix aim to resolve.
So let's delineate them.
Okay, the framework of diabetes management operates on a spectrum. The most common state by far is improved control.
Improved.
Yes. This occurs when a patient utilizes medications, such as metformin, exogenous insulin, or GLP-1 receptor agonists, in conjunction with lifestyle modifications to maintain their blood glucose levels within a statistically normal, safe range.
But the critical distinction with improved control is that the underlying pathology is entirely active, correct?
Yes.
It's a managed state. Like, if the patient stops taking the prescribed medication or abandons the dietary framework, their blood glucose levels will immediately escalate back to toxic diagnostic levels.
Thinks that way.
The medication is just acting as a continuous suppression system.
Correct. The condition is managed, it's not resolved.
Okay.
Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum is the concept of a cure.
The Holy Grail.
Right. But in medical terminology, a true cure implies that the underlying pathology has been permanently eradicated.
Permanently.
It means the biological mechanisms that cause the disease have been completely corrected, and the patient has zero risk of the disease returning, regardless of their future behaviors or environmental exposures.
Like curing an infection with antibiotics.
Exactly. Based on current clinical science, there is no cure for type 2 diabetes.
None.
None. The genetic susceptibility, the metabolic blueprint that allowed the disease to manifest in the first place, will always remain present in the patient's physiology.
So wait, if control is a lifelong suppression system and a cure is biologically impossible, what exactly is the reversal that the iMedix protocol framework is pointing toward?
Right.
If the genetic blueprint is permanent, how does a patient navigate to a state of reversal?
Okay, so the precise clinical term for reversal is actually remission,
Remission.
like with cancer.
Very similar concept. Remission represents a highly specific, empirically measured metabolic state. It is officially defined as achieving and maintaining blood glucose levels below the diagnostic threshold for diabetes.
That's just why.
Specifically, an HbA1c level of less than 6.5%.
Okay.
And maintaining that for an extended duration, typically at least 3 to 6 months, entirely without the use of active glucose-lowering medications. Wow. That distinction is monumental. Achieving normal blood sugar levels without the ongoing mechanical resistance of pharmacology.
Yes.
So the body's intrinsic systems are managing the glucose load independently again.
Exactly.
But for a listener trying to understand the mechanics of this path, how is that even physiologically possible? If the pancreas was failing to regulate glucose, how does it suddenly regain the capacity to do so without chemical intervention?
To understand the mechanism of remission, the educational resources first have to explain the architectural failure that actually causes type 2 diabetes.
Okay, let's build the map.
The disease is primarily driven by a dual pathology: severe insulin resistance and subsequent beta cell dysfunction.
Beta cells.
Yes. Insulin is the hormone secreted by the beta cells in the pancreas. Its function is to bind to receptors on the surface of your cells, signaling them to open up and absorb glucose from the bloodstream to be used as cellular energy.
So it's a chemical signaling system. The insulin is the messenger telling the cell to clear the glucose out of the blood. But in type 2 diabetes, that signaling system degrades.
It breaks down primarily due to the accumulation of ectopic fat.
Ectopic fat.
Specifically, visceral fat that is deposited directly inside the liver and the pancreas. Not just under the skin, but inside the organs.
Oh, wow.
This creates a toxic lipid environment, which causes the cellular receptors to downregulate. They literally become deaf to the insulin signal.
So that's what insulin resistance is.
That is insulin resistance. The glucose cannot enter the cells, so it just accumulates in the bloodstream.
Right.
The pancreas detects this rising blood sugar, and attempts to force the issue by hyper-secreting massive, abnormal quantities of insulin.
So it's overcompensating for the resistance. The pancreas is basically shouting because the cells aren't listening.
That is a great way to put it.
But an organ can only operate at maximum overdrive for so long before it sustains structural damage, right?
Exactly. Over time, the constant demand, combined with the toxic effects of the visceral fat suffocating the organ, causes the beta cells in the pancreas to exhaust, dedifferentiate, and eventually die.
They just burn out.
They burn out. The insulin production drops, and the disease accelerates rapidly. Understanding this specific mechanical breakdown is what allows a patient to understand the protocol for remission.
Okay, so the path to reversal is fundamentally the process of removing that ectopic fat to restore the signaling pathways.
Yes.
So the interventions required to navigate this path, which the protocol highlights as weight loss, nutrition, physical activity, metabolic surgery, and early intervention, they are not just generic wellness advice.
Not at all.
They are targeted, systemic interventions designed to drain the toxic lipid environment from the liver and pancreas.
Exactly.
Let's look at the specific application of these tools, because when we talk about nutrition in the context of achieving remission, we aren't just talking about casually reducing portion sizes or swapping out soda for water.
No, we are talking about utilizing nutrition as a primary medical intervention.
A primary medical intervention. Okay, what does that look like?
Nutrition in a remission protocol is often deployed as a massive shock to the metabolic system. Yes. The clinical data supporting remission heavily relies on significant rapid weight loss, often achieving a 10% to 15% reduction in total body weight in a relatively short period.
That is substantial.
It is. This is frequently accomplished through intensive low-calorie dietary interventions or highly structured carbohydrate restriction.
Okay, so why so fast and so extreme?
The physiological goal is to force the body into a state of negative energy balance so profound that it is compelled to rapidly mobilize and burn the visceral fat stores located specifically in the hepatic and pancreatic tissue.
So you are systematically dismantling the physical barrier that caused the insulin resistance in the first place.
Exactly.
And physical activity acts as the secondary pillar to this process. Obviously, exercise increases caloric expenditure, which aids the weight loss. But structurally, what is happening at the cellular level when a patient incorporates rigorous physical activity into the specific protocol?
Well, skeletal muscle is the largest consumer of glucose in the human body.
The muscles eat the sugar.
Right. It acts as the primary disposal sink for blood sugar. The critical, often misunderstood mechanism here is that during intense physical activity, muscle contractions can stimulate glucose uptake through pathways that are completely independent of insulin.
Wait, let me make sure I'm visualizing this correctly structurally. Even if the body is suffering from severe insulin resistance, even if the standard signaling pathways we talked about are broken, the physical contraction of the muscle forces the cell to absorb glucose anyway.
Yes.
It just bypasses the broken system entirely.
It provides an alternate metabolic pathway.
That is incredible.
It is. Furthermore, consistent physical activity increases the density of mitochondria within the muscle cells and actually upregulates the insulin receptors over time, gradually restoring systemic insulin sensitivity.
Wow.
So it's a dual action intervention. It provides immediate clearance of blood glucose during the activity, and it repairs the underlying structural resistance in the long term.
See, this highlights exactly why independent educational resources are so mandatory.
Oh, so?
Because if a patient is just told by their doctor to exercise more, they view it as a chore, you know? It feels like a generic punishment for poor health.
Right. Go for a walk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if they are provided the health literacy to understand that skeletal muscle contraction provides an alternate insulin-independent pathway for glucose clearance, they understand the mechanical utility of the intervention.
They're pulling a specific physiological lever.
Yes. They aren't just working out, they are manually clearing glucose.
Yeah.
But the protocol also mentions a much more aggressive intervention, which is metabolic surgery.
Yes.
How does a surgical alteration of the digestive tract fit into a path about reversing a metabolic disease?
So metabolic or bariatric surgery, like a Roux-en gastric bypass or a sleeve gastrectomy, is currently one of the most statistically effective interventions for achieving sustained remission in patients with severe obesity and type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
Now, the common misconception is that the surgery only works through forced caloric restriction.
Right, that by reducing the physical volume of the stomach, the patient simply cannot eat as much, leading to weight loss.
Exactly. And while restriction is certainly a factor, the true mechanism of remission is far more complex and involves profound endocrinological shifts.
So the surgery isn't just a physical plumbing adjustment, it actively alters the hormonal signaling system of the body.
Dramatically.
How?
By physically bypassing sections of the stomach and the upper intestine, the surgery immediately alters the secretion of gut hormones. Most notably, it massively increases the natural production of GLP-1.
Oh, GLP-1, the same thing those new injectable drugs target.
Exactly the same pathway.
Yeah.
These hormonal shifts enhance insulin secretion from the pancreas and drastically improve peripheral insulin sensitivity.
Wow.
And what is really fascinating and what clearly demonstrates that this is a hormonal mechanism and not just weight loss is that patients frequently achieve euglycemia.
Which is normalized blood sugar levels.
Right. They achieve that within days of the procedure, long before any significant physical weight loss has actually occurred.
That is a profound piece of medical reality. The structural alteration of the gut instantly rewires the metabolic communication pathways.
Instantly.
But, making the decision to undergo metabolic surgery requires an immense amount of rigorous, unbiased data.
Oh, absolutely.
A patient has to navigate the immediate surgical risks, the lifelong requirements for specific vitamin and mineral supplementation due to the altered absorption, and the potential for severe complications.
It's a permanent alteration.
Right. You absolutely cannot source that decision from a promotional brochure handed out by a surgical center that profits from doing the surgery.
No, you cannot.
You need the independent platform. You need the interactive safety database to understand how your existing medications will be absorbed by a surgically altered digestive tract.
You are identifying the exact intersection of the two themes here. The sheer complexity of the remission protocol necessitates the independence of the information platform.
They rely on each other.
They do. And there is one final, absolutely critical component to this path that demands immediate patient education.
Okay, what is it?
The concept of early intervention.
Early intervention.
Yes. The biological window for achieving remission is not permanently open. It is highly time-sensitive.
Let's analyze the structural reason for that time limit. Why is reversing the condition significantly more viable in the first few years after diagnosis compared to, say, a decade later?
Right.
Because if the intervention is draining the visceral fat, shouldn't losing the fat work regardless of the timeline?
You would think so, but no, it's because of the progressive nature of the beta cell destruction.
Oh, the burnout we talked about earlier.
Exactly. We discussed earlier that the toxic lipid environment and the constant hypersecretion of insulin cause the beta cells to exhaust and die.
Yeah.
If a patient implements the remission protocol, max of weight loss, normalized metabolic signaling, within the first few years of diagnosis, the beta cells that are dormant or just functionally suppressed by the toxic environment can literally wake up.
They can heal.
They can regain their capacity to produce insulin.
But if the patient waits too long?
If the disease is allowed to progress for 10, 15, or 20 years, the damage to the pancreatic tissue becomes completely irreversible.
Irreversible.
Yes. Apoptosis, which is cellular death, occurs.
The cells are gone.
They are gone. No amount of weight loss, nutritional intervention, or metabolic surgery can resurrect pancreatic beta cells that have ceased to exist.
Wow.
Once the absolute beta cell mass drops below a critical threshold, the patient will permanently require exogenous insulin to survive. The chance for remission is permanently lost.
See, this brings the tragedy of health illiteracy into incredibly sharp focus.
Doesn't it?
If a patient leaves the clinic confused by the abstraction of their diagnosis, and they spend the next 5 years just bouncing between denial, fear, and useless single-product miracle supplements marketed by social media algorithms,
They're losing time.
they aren't just wasting money, they are actively burning through their biological window for true physiological remission.
Exactly.
The delay caused by bad information carries a permanent physiological cost.
That is the ultimate stake here. And it is also why the protocol relies on the term remission rather than cure.
Right.
Patient education must include the reality that remission is a precarious state. It is not necessarily permanent. Even if a patient successfully navigates the path, achieves a normal HbA1c without medication, and restores their beta cell function, the structural vulnerabilities remain.
Okay, so what triggers the collapse of remission then? If they've cleared the visceral fat and the signaling is restored, what causes the disease to return?
The most common trigger by far is weight regain.
Ah.
If the patient deviates from the nutritional and physical activity frameworks that achieved the remission in the first place, the ectopic fat will quickly redeposit in the liver and pancreas.
And the cycle starts again.
Right. The insulin resistance will reestablish itself rapidly because the genetic blueprint for that metabolic failure is still active.
It's always there in the background.
Yes. Furthermore, even in completely healthy individuals, pancreatic beta cell function naturally declines with advanced age.
Oh, just from getting older.
It's from getting older. So a patient in remission is starting with a compromised beta cell reserve. Natural aging alone may eventually tip them back over the diagnostic threshold, even if they keep the weight off.
Which means the concept of navigation never actually ends.
Never.
Even when you reach the destination of remission, you must actively hold your ground. You have to maintain the behavioral architecture. You need long-term monitoring, continuously checking your HbA1c, monitoring for things like peripheral neuropathy, ensuring cardiovascular health.
Yes.
The protocol is a lifelong engagement with your own physiology.
It is a continuous feedback loop. And when a patient is educated on this entirely unvarnished reality, the complex mechanics of insulin resistance, the rigorous demands of sustained weight loss, the permanence of the genetic blueprint, and the transient nature of remission, the cognitive vulnerability we discussed earlier completely evaporates.
Exactly. Because when you understand the sheer monumental biological complexity required to reverse type 2 diabetes, the idea that a specialized tea or a magnetic bracelet or some unverified herbal supplement could achieve this outcome becomes instantaneously absurd.
It's laughable.
It is a structural impossibility. The single-product solution is a predatory myth that relies entirely on the patient's ignorance of their own cellular mechanics.
Precisely.
Remission is not a consumer good you can purchase. It is a rigorous metabolic state you must earn and maintain through a documented, evidence-based protocol.
And that realization, that is the ultimate defense mechanism provided by independent medical information.
Yeah.
When the data is objective, when the databases map the true systemic interactions, and when the educational resources translate that data into functional health literacy, the patient is immunized against manipulation.
Immunized, I love that.
They are equipped to handle the realities of their diagnosis.
So let's synthesize the structural reality of everything we have explored in this deep dive. We began by identifying the critical, non-negotiable requirement for independent medical information platforms like iMedix. We established that the commercial internet is structurally incapable of prioritizing patient safety, which necessitates a neutral sanctuary where clinical data is completely decoupled from marketing incentives.
Yes, the firewall.
Then we examined the architecture of drug databases, recognizing them not just as static lists, but as dynamic, interactive webs of pharmacokinetic safety that protect patients from the cascading mathematical errors of polypharmacy.
The metabolic pathways.
Right. We then traced the systemic failure of risk communication, identifying how generic, abstracted warning labels cause patients to either paralyze themselves with unwarranted fear or completely dismiss genuine physiological dangers.
ULA effect.
Exactly. And we noted how this alienation from authentic medical science makes the public dangerously vulnerable to the frictionless promises of pseudoscience.
The magic pills.
Yes. And finally, we applied that informational rigor to the massive medical framework of navigating diabetes reversal. We delineated the critical boundaries between control, cure, and remission.
Vital distinctions.
We explored the cellular mechanics of insulin resistance, the targeted interventions of visceral fat reduction and metabolic surgery, and the absolute unforgiving time sensitivity of the biological window for early intervention.
Right before the beta cells die.
We established that true remission is possible, but it requires continuous, lifelong navigation, because you cannot successfully travel a complex clinical path if you cannot independently verify the map.
The integrity of the information dictates the safety of the outcome. It's really that simple.
Yeah.
You must comprehend the physiological mechanics of your treatments. You must possess the vocabulary to engage collaboratively with your physician. Health literacy is not a luxury. It is a primary survival tool in the modern medical landscape.
You cannot afford to be a passive passenger in the waiting room of your own life. When those clinic doors close behind you and you step into that parking lot holding a diagnosis, you are stepping onto a highly complex path. You have to be an active, educated navigator.
Absolutely.
And we want to leave you with a final structural thought to consider. If the detailed resources provided by platforms like iMedix highlight just how profoundly we misunderstand the risks and the true mechanical nature of chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes, It forces a much larger, more systemic question.
You really does.
How many other scientifically verified paths to remission for a whole spectrum of chronic diseases currently exist in the clinical data, but remain entirely invisible to the public simply because we do not yet have the widespread, independent educational maps required to navigate them?